You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more on state politics with University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson. Right after the session was gavelled to a close, both Republicans and Democrats traveled the state talking about their party's successes in the legislature and the issues that their opponents brought up and how detrimental they might have been to the state of Minnesota and the welfare of Minnesota citizens. We heard a lot of Republican talk about the Democrats overreaching. Of course, the Democrats came back to power in what you might call a wave election in 2012, took control of both houses of the state legislature. Obviously, they had a governor already in place in Mark Dayton. Did the Democrats push too hard? They got most of their tax initiatives through. They were able to get the same-sex marriage legislation passed. Is this reflecting what the voters wanted, perhaps a mandate, or could the Democrats have read perhaps a little bit too much into what the voters' intentions really were when they put the Democrats back in power after the November 2012 elections?
Well, it is certainly the case that elections have consequences, and I think this session really clearly shows that. The policy differences between this session and the last could not be more stark on everything from economic to social issues. I mean, I think Democrats are vulnerable actually on two fronts. One is overreaching, and it remains to be seen. Again, I think how the higher taxes on the wealthiest Minnesotans, the increase on cigarette taxes, how some of these things affect everyday Minnesotans and what the reaction is. But then there are also charges on the DFL side that perhaps they actually didn't do enough. I mean, what happened to the minimum wage bills that passed in both the House and the Senate, but where conferees couldn't agree? Gun control legislation was another top priority among DFLers that was actually not addressed. And so while there will definitely be charges of overreaching, again, particularly on the tax issue, I think it's also possible that Democrats will be vulnerable to some charges that they didn't accomplish all that they could. But what will be interesting to see is how much is done in the next session. Traditionally, we think of the year after a big budget as a bonding bill year, but not that much else. But it will be interesting to see if the DFL majorities come back with, for example, a minimum wage agreement, a bigger transportation bill, a bigger bonding bill. And so I think the story of this legislature will continue to be written in the next session in a little bit unusual twist.
With single-party control of the legislature, of the governor's mansion, how much influence do the Republicans really have in this past legislative session?
Well, certainly Governor Dayton had said that he wanted to act in a bipartisan way. He wouldn't, for example, sign election reform if it weren't bipartisan, and indeed the bill, which was ultimately watered down to get bipartisan support, was bipartisan. The bonding bill has to be bipartisan in order to pass, which is actually why the larger version failed. So I think I would have to say, on balance, there really hasn't been that much bipartisanship. That is not a change from the past legislature. We didn't see a lot of bipartisanship with Governor Pawlenty and Republicans in charge either. But it does make it tough to really gain credibility among Minnesota voters when they constantly see partisan legislative victories, whether it's partisan on the DFL side or partisan on the Republican side. It's just increasingly difficult in today's polarized climate where Republicans and Democrats, for the most part, have pretty different views of public policy to build these bipartisan majorities. But I also think because of the party competition, even in policy areas where it's possible, it's just less likely to happen.
Is single-party control of state legislatures becoming more common?
That's a tough question to answer. What we've seen become increasingly common are wave elections, elections where one party just overwhelms the other party. And it seems, we've certainly seen many in the past, but it seems these wave elections just continue to recur. We saw one in 2006, we saw one in 2008, again in 2012. And so with these wave elections, they tend to bring in bigger majorities and changes all in the same directions. So we are seeing more wave elections, which often comes with one-party control. On the other hand, these wave elections then make the next election vulnerable to another wave in the opposite direction, because with wave election come so many legislators who are ushered in but then are vulnerable if the wave turns or there's simply no wave. So one of the results is that the party in control doesn't necessarily see a long time horizon. They think we really need to get everything done in this cycle because who knows if we'll have control in the next one.
Turning to presidential politics now, the Obama administration is facing three significant challenges. One, of course, is the IRS's scrutiny of nonprofit organizations that had conservative political agendas. We're also looking at a lot of controversy over the Justice Department securing the phone records of reporters from the Associated Press. And finally, the attack on the American consulate in Benghazi. That controversy continues onward. What are the numbers showing? Are these scandals that the American public seems particularly concerned about?
Interestingly, even though Republicans have been out front on all these scandals, very critical of the Obama administration, particularly now as we're seeing congressional hearings, the public really does not appear to have been that moved by these scandals. The Benghazi attack is not new news, and so I think people had already really formed their opinions of that. And even though the concerns about the IRS and the Justice Department are quite serious, it's not at all clear what the president's role, if any, was in these scandals. Now, of course, he's been criticized for not knowing about these scandals, but that even as questions remain about to what extent did he know or when did he know, and I think some of these details are still coming out. But interestingly, these scandals don't really seem to have affected public opinion that much, if at all. And it could be the timing of these scandals. It could be the polarized cues that people are getting, where the outrage is really on one side of the aisle, but they don't really seem to have affected public opinion at this point. Of course, it's still possible that we'll learn new details which do have a bigger effect on public opinion, but as of now, they really haven't seemed to have moved it.
The Affordable Health Care law continues to draw harsh criticism from Republicans. As a matter of fact, the Republican-controlled House for the 37th time attempted to repeal so-called Obamacare. Is there a precedent for this? Have we ever seen an instance where a legislative body has tried to repeal a piece of legislation for 37 times?
I certainly can't think of one, and I have not been made aware of one in studying this issue. 37 votes on repealing all or part of this legislation does seem historic. And I was initially surprised that there was once again another vote to repeal all of Obamacare. But then I think what really happened is the 80 new Republican members of the House, who in fact hadn't had the opportunity to vote to repeal it in the last Congress, really wanted their chance to go on the record voting for the repeal of Obamacare. Now, of course, they ran against it. It should be well known to their constituents, but this actually gives them something to take back to their district and say, I cast a vote against it, even though I wasn't in Congress originally when it was passed. But there are pros and cons on both sides. I think that Republicans have drawn criticism for casting yet another symbolic vote that no one thinks will actually become law, because of course the democratically controlled Senate won't pass this, nor would the president sign the repeal of Obamacare. So it's just an example of how Congress, casts a lot of symbolic votes that actually don't go anywhere. And it gives Democrats opportunities to attack vulnerable Republicans who cast that vote as well. So there are pros and cons on both sides.
What are the polling numbers indicating about Americans' approval or disapproval of Obamacare?
It really depends on whether or not you ask them about the entire bill or whether or not you take out portions of it. It still remains unpopular among the American public, in part because a lot of Americans think that it's too much government, but on the other hand, some of its lack of support come from Americans who don't think it's enough government. So it really isn't doing particularly well as a whole in the polls. But if you take out particular pieces of the healthcare legislation, such as keeping your child on till they're 25 or eliminating pre-existing conditions, some of the extra benefits in terms of coverage, then there are individual items that are very popular. And so as Republicans think about their strategy for either blocking implementation of some or trying to repeal parts, they really have to think about whether or not strategically it makes sense to focus on all of the bill or some of the bill. But the bottom line is, with the president reelected and a Democratic Senate, implementation will continue, and it will continue to be the law of the land, at least for a while.
A recent Pew Foundation survey showed that the 18 to 30 generation, the so-called millennials, are deeply cynical toward American politics. Tell us more about what we know about the political attitudes of this generation, and how will this impact the two major parties potentially?
Well, certainly it is hip to be cynical, and that has always been the case. We have always seen trust in government at lower levels than I think some are comfortable with. But these lower levels of trust do not necessarily mean that there's going to be revolution, or that people are, not going to vote, or that the government is somehow illegitimate. I think that there's something ritualistic about saying that there is cynicism or distrust of government, because Americans value a free press, the right to question their elected officials, and always the right to demand something better. That said, we are seeing more cynicism, and that is troubling. And I think part of it is because of the partisan polarization that we're seeing, where legislators across the aisle just are really having a hard time coming together, and they're more likely to yell at each other than work with each other. We're also seeing some scandals, although that trend has really been a continuation of what's happened since Watergate in the way that affects public opinion. But what we've seen in the last couple of presidential elections among younger Americans is a real shift to a Democratic Party identification, at least in voting at the presidential level. Now, we haven't seen these voters emerge at midterm elections, which is problematic for Democrats, but certainly looking at party identification at the presidential level, that's a trend that's problematic for Republicans. And so I think the real question is, to what extent will the cynical younger generation abstain altogether, abstain in midterms, or start to vote more regularly as members of older generations do?
In the wake of the 2012 elections, there were a number of members of the Republican Party national leaders who came out and said, this should be a wake-up call to our party. We need to change the Republican Party. We need to adapt it to the changing demographics in America. What have you seen happen so far, and do you think there is a plan? Is there a critical mass of Republicans who are concerned about the future of the party, given what happened in the 2012 election and given some of the monumental attitudinal and demographic changes we've seen in this country?
That's a great question. And we certainly heard a lot about Republican leaders getting together and trying to encourage the party to reach out to Latinos and Latinas, for example, a group that voted even more overwhelmingly in 2012 than in 2008 for President Obama. But I think the real question is, what's going to happen with immigration, and where will Republicans come down on immigration? So far, this group of 8 senators who is working on a bipartisan basis for immigration reform appears to have some success. They've moved a bill through committee, and senators on both sides of the aisle are foregoing some provisions that they in fact would like to have added to the bill to keep this compromise intact. So if a bipartisan agreement on immigration can be reached in both the Senate and the House, I think that would actually go a long way toward improving Republicans' chances among Hispanic voters. But it's not enough. It's not enough. And I think that Republicans still have some work to do going into the next election, and the choice of a candidate will be really consequential. Marco Rubio is certainly a formidable Republican challenger, and I think that support for him would also go a long way toward helping Republicans' image among voters of color.
Currently, there are 7 major candidates for mayor of Minneapolis, and with a new system of ranked choice voting in the city, it's hard to tell who has the initial advantage. When Access Minnesota returns, more on the elections in Minneapolis in 2014.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.